your book and the talk. But before diving into that, do you have any reactions to having seen the full program now and what was in it? What jumped out to you? Thoughts that it stirred, new observations?
I mean, it stirred a lot of emotions. It was incredibly powerful. And one thing that struck me sort of explains why war is so hard to talk about and come to a final conclusion, a final resting place about. It's because the experience of it is so varied. I mean, it just, there's so many different ways of experiencing war, and many are just devastating and incredibly sad, and some are actually quite powerful and compelling. And you kind of see some of that variety in these talks, and it's no wonder it's an eternal human problem and human question, sort of talking about this thing called war, which we don't seem to be able to get rid of. So when you can't get rid of something, you have to ask what function it's serving.
Yeah.
And that's a long, long question.
Well, one that you have several answers to, thankfully. The book is dope. Read it, buy it. He'll sign it later. I guarantee it. But I will start with a quote from your book that I think leads to an interesting path. You wrote that the beauty and the tragedy of the modern world is that it eliminates many situations that require people to demonstrate a commitment to the collective good. In other words, we rarely have to risk our lives for others anymore. We have outsourced this largely. We have specialized it. And I don't think you're quite calling for the abolition of police departments and fire departments and emergency medical technicians, but we have prioritized private good so much in our society. We made very clear incentives, and we've lost some of that around the collective good, especially when it comes to that risk-taking and risk-sharing. What path do you see back to that from this very specialized brink that we've placed ourselves in?
Well, I studied anthropology in college, and I see everything through that lens. I mean, as a journalist, that's how I sort of understand things. Humans evolved to live in groups of 30, 40, 50 people that they knew very well, roughly the people in this room.
Lock the doors. We have a new
Lock the
society.
doors.
New
Yeah.
society.
And you know them very, very well, and you rely on them for your life, and they on you. We evolved in an occasionally extremely harsh environment. And there was no personal survival outside of the collective good. In other words, in just sort of practical evolutionary terms, it made sense to invest completely in the collective good because your own personal survival lay in that, and vice versa. That's 99% of human history, 2 million years of human history. And around 10,000 years ago, agriculture evolved and things changed. Now we live in a modern society, and we're extremely lucky that it's, compared to much of our history, it's very safe. It's safe from disease, often safe from violence. There's a diversification of labor. We're not all hunting and killing our own food or even growing it. We are not personally attending to our own defense of people who would do violence to us. All of those things are absolutely wonderful. But what it means is that suddenly we can live a life where we're not demonstrating our loyalty to us, to everyone else, to the group, to the people we love, the people we care about. Not only are we rarely, thank God, rarely called upon to risk our life, a lot of people aren't even called upon to give up their lunch for someone else. The sharing of food in a hunter-gatherer society in a marginal environment, the sharing of food with people you love is risking your life. It's one and the same thing. And we don't even have to do that. And one of the primary ways of identifying yourself is, who would I give up my life for? Or at least give up my lunch for? Like, that's who I am. We don't get the chance, the opportunity, and we're not forced to declare who those people are. And again, that's a great fortune, but there's a psychological loss to that. And so, a long preamble to answer your question. What do? We don't want to rewind society to its this sort of like the Hobbesian depths, right? And we want to live in an affluent, wonderful society.
Yeah, I'm not giving up my seamless, man.
Yeah, right.
Like,
That's right.
Sorry.
But I think there are things we can do to demonstrate that we're all in this together. And the thing is, it's just not as obvious that we're all in this together. That we're 50 people in the Kalahari Desert. It's not as obvious, but modern society, we are still on a planet that's in jeopardy. We are still in some ways, we don't know what the future is, and it isn't necessarily good. We don't know, right? And so I think one thing we can do, the easiest thing to do is get the use of contempt and disrespect and insult out of public speech. I think that is incredibly divisive to this country, and if this country divides, the world divides.
Some people like that answer. Interesting. I disagree strongly. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. What you wrote about an encounter with a woman who had been involved in the wars in Bosnia, and she missed the wars, and she said it was the happiest time in her life. She said they laughed more, and that they were in this animal state. I want to push you further on how do we get to the good parts of our animal state without returning to a state of war to activate it in us. So discourse, that's good, but are there other things you've seen that have helped people through this, that have helped you through this, that have helped other groups?
Yeah, let me clarify. This woman's name was Nidzara, and she's Bosnian. She was not in the U.S. military stationed in Bosnia after the war. She was in Bosnia, a 17-year-old girl in Sarajevo during the war. Sarajevo was besieged by Bosnian Serb forces that basically used the civilian population as a shooting gallery for 3 years. They killed or wounded a fifth of the city, 20% of the city. Nidzara was wounded by tank rounds that hit her parents' apartment. It almost took off her leg. She had full reconstructive surgery on her leg to save it without anesthesia. They lived a collective life in Sarajevo. I was there during those days. They grew vegetables in the median strips. They sheltered in basements. They protected each other. They lived together, and they got through the war. And then when the war was over, things got better. And now, 20 years later, I was back in Sarajevo last summer. It's a wonderful, beautiful city. And Nidzara said to me, we all missed the war because we were better people then. We were generous to each other. That's the problem with affluence, is that as society gets affluent, people make individualistic choices, and they stop caring about each other. Ironically, they become less generous. What do we do about that? I don't know. I have to assume there's a lot of sort of ancient human wiring that goes into that because it's so common. I wish I had a great answer with the 3 minutes left. I'm watching these signs here like, oh my God, I got to solve the world's problems in 2 minutes.
Right. Yes. Not all the world, just war.
I think, but seriously, I think just correctly understanding that dynamic it gets us halfway to fixing it, to changing our society in a way without losing the great benefits of our affluence and our openness.
All right. Are we out of time? We're not. Okay, then I'm going to go one more because it's even more to some of the point that we've seen on the screen tonight. You talked about the PTSD rates in this country. In the U.S., in your book, you talk about it being twice as high as in the U.K. In terms of rate. So that's really twice as high, even though we have a larger absolute number probably. Israel, which has pretty much universal military service going on, and we don't. And you talked about disability and the disability claims, and maybe we should relabel it. But you also talked about this idea of victimhood and how the language that we use to describe the veteran experience, the extreme levels of sympathy, and this idea that people who may not have seen themselves as victims are actually treated as victims by society that wants to help but may be doing more to hurt by casting it in that light. Could you share a bit more about that idea? Because I think a lot of people in this room, certainly a lot of people who might be watching this on Facebook Live, what's up, think that they're saying the right words and doing the right things, but they actually could be making things worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very tricky. You want to honor veterans. In fact, let me just say, you want to honor a lot of different kinds of people in this society, people we depend on. And veterans are one of those groups. And you want to honor them. And you want to acknowledge that some of them, many of them, went through extremely difficult circumstances. And it cost them a lot personally. They lost friends. They might have lost limbs. They encountered real psychic trauma, some of them did. You want to acknowledge that. But what's tricky, and I think our society has a tough time with this, when you acknowledge suffering, what you don't want to do is take that next step and say that the person who suffered is a victim, because that disempowers them. And I think there is a way of acknowledging the real sacrifice of people in uniform, or firemen, or cops, or all kinds of people, frankly. I mean, we don't need to stop at the military.
Big sacrifice.
I started out as a journalist writing about dangerous jobs. In 2014, more people died in dangerous jobs in 1 year than in both the Afghan and Iraq wars combined, right? So people pay with their lives in all kinds of different ways to keep this country going. What you don't want to do, while acknowledging and honoring all that, you don't want to take that step and start thinking of them as victims, because they might. And if they think of themselves as victims, and it can be a seductive way to think. If they do, they will never as victims lead a normal life with the country they fought for. And that, you don't want that to happen. They don't want that to happen. It's going to take the whole country to kind of sort that out. It's very complicated.
Well, thank you for writing the book on it, which again, he'll be signing. Again, it's dope. And there's a great backstory to it that I left as a kind of surprise for them, the way you open it up. It's trust me, it's going to be fantastic. So please, a warm round of applause for Sebastian Junger. And with the rest of our panelists, please come on up. I'll make space and reintroduce you lightly. I'm also going to create a little bit of a curve in the chair. Quick change, everybody. Give it up for the quick change. This is good. Want to reward good behavior. So in addition to Sebastian, we have the badass Major General Linda Singh with us here, Admiral of the state of Maryland. Thank you. I want you to motivate me like you did those kids, like every morning. I would brush my teeth so much better with a woman with a gun just standing right there. And the flag on your shoulder. Thank you very much. We have Garrett Combs, Army veteran, and with Veterans Coming Home, Garrett. And we have Michael Primo, filmmaker, multi-platform storyteller, also with Veterans Coming Home, and other projects like Sandy's Storyline and Housing is a Human Right. So I'll start with a broader question, the same one I tossed to Sebastian. Does anything else pop off that screen for you, having seen the whole program, where you're like, yo, I never thought about it like that. I didn't see myself like that before. I look good in uniform. Like anything at all come up for you that jumps off that screen? Yeah.
Well, I would say the first thing for me is I just came off of a whirlwind tour and came back from the Middle East just recently. And the one thing that it strikes me, and then also listening to Sebastian kind of talk about us as a society, and what pops off of the screen at me is that many of us, while we love our veterans, we really don't know them. And we don't know pain, and we don't know suffering at this day and age in this country. And so that's the big thing that pops off the screen to me.
You could have just dropped the mic after that. Thank you. That was profound and beautiful. Garrett, I wanted to ask you about a follow-up to the question to Sebastian, and this is about how we should treat interact with, what are the right words to say to someone who's served. And I want to give you, there's like a multiple choice option, and you can tell us, you have 5 options, like, I'm walking down the street, I come across a veteran, do I say, thank you for your service? And do it like with great gravitas, right? Maybe even slow motion. That's the option 1, thank you for your service. Number 2, do I let veterans board a flight, say 30 seconds, before everybody else gets to board a flight? Like, is that more meaningful than thank you for your service? Option 3, do I tie a big ribbon on a tree or a car or like an antelope or any other large object, depending on where I'm living? Obviously, I don't want to be sensitive to people who live in rural areas versus cities. Should I just chant USA, USA, USA? Or, and this is the most creative one, do I sing Mariah Carey's Hero just as best as I can? What options, those are your options, 1 through 5. What have you found works the best? And if none of those, what might work better?
Option number 6.
6.
A beer usually does
A
the
beer, okay, okay.
I think that's a common question. And I think the most important thing to identify when you ask that question is who are you talking about? Because the experience of veterans varies vastly. You could be spend your deployment sleeping in the dirt without showering for 60 days at a time, kicking indoors every night, or like some of the guys in Restrepo, you know, living in the mountains in a small unit, which is the minority. Or you could be the majority, which are primarily in support roles, who live on larger bases, who spend their time working in logistics or mechanics or supply or you know, intel. Like, those 2 experiences, although they're in the same country and they're in the same you know, branch of the government or whatever, are vastly different experiences. So when someone says to me, thank you for your service, my gut reaction is, you don't really know what you're thanking me for. Where some people's gut reaction is, you're welcome. Like, I love my job. I love my job and I can't wait to get out and like work for the government. So they're 2 different experiences, and I don't know that there's any right way to do it. I think the important thing is elevating the conversation. And as a society, understanding that the people who are part of that minority may want to talk about some things, and they may want to share things, they may want to tell their story without it feeling like they're telling war stories, or without it feeling like they are trying to glorify what they did, but rather to cleanse themselves and get it off their chest to somebody who feels like they did it for them. And I think that is something to keep in mind when you talk to veterans. But like, you can't lump them all in and say like, I mean, Mariah Carey singing me a song at the airport, letting me on the flight 30 minutes before while I drink a beer would be pretty cool, but I got...
All right, we can fund that. We can fund that. There's federal funding available for that VA program. That would solve the whole VA situation, too, if Mariah Carey just sang to everyone one at a time, obviously. Sebastian, in your book, you actually proposed something. You used the word cleanse, and sharing the story not as an act of glory or self-glorification, but as a catharsis. And there was something, could you just share a bit more about this Veterans Day kind of story sharing thing that you
I was
observed?
looking at, I did my field work on the Navajo Reservation, and I looked a little bit into how the Native tribes in North America dealt with war. I mean, they were most of them very, very warlike societies. There's no evidence that that their warriors got PTSD for any length of time. Suicide and depression were also virtually non-existent in these societies. So they're doing something right. And one of the things that was used in bringing warriors back into the community after a fight was to allow them to sing and dance and retell what they did on the battlefield for their people. And there was essentially this sort of cathartic process where you recount for the people that you fought for what you did for them. And I think often it was cast in sort of heroic terms, and I killed this many people, and I did it, whatever. I mean, okay, go ahead, boast, whatever you want to do, but it was cathartic, and it was in the midst of the community. And obviously, we're not a tribalized society, and we're not going to throw Western civilization into reverse and go back to, but there may be a way to sort of retrofit it for our society Suppose you opened up the town halls in every town in this country. I mean, that's the sort of ritual, sacred space of every American community, right? Is the town hall. Suppose you open them up every Veterans Day, and veterans of any war had the right to stand up and talk for 10 minutes about what the war felt like to them. This isn't an exercise in patriotism. It's not an anti-war demonstration. It's just an emotional experience. And they would be saying that to everyone in the community who likes to say, I support the troops. What does that mean? No one knows, right? But now it would mean actually showing up at town hall and listening to these people say what they have to say. Some are going to be incredibly proud. Some are literally going to say, I missed the war. Like, I wish I was over there. Some are going to be so angry, they're going to yell they're going to scream the whole time. I've seen it happen. Some are going to be so sad that they're going to cry and they won't be able to speak. And that's all you're going to get from them is their sorrow. But all of that is the experience of war. And if they can do that, then the experience of war is owned by all of us. It's not bottled up in them. It belongs to the nation. I mean, and it's our war. It's not the soldiers' war. They did what we asked them to do. We own it. And they're stuck with the emotions from it. But if you could do this, the emotional consequences of war, and I mean the good consequences as well as the bad consequences, the emotional consequences of war would be owned by all of us. And that would be a sort of tribal way of doing things.
I want to segue from that right to you, Michael Primo, and the storytelling that you do. And this idea of veterans telling their own story, like that's your work, not just with veterans, but with people in housing crises, people post-Sandy, Occupy Sandy, like the ability to put a camera or a microphone or a page to someone to let them articulate their own. Could you talk about your work in that area and how you've seen that apply to this Veterans Coming Home project?
Yeah, thank you. I think in the context of this Veteran Coming Home project, we have an opportunity because very often I feel like these veteran conversations and what we've experienced, and it's, I think, backing up to say that it's been interesting that this crew is made up of 2 people who have served in the military and 2 people who haven't. So some of our conversations that we've had have been some of the most profound explorations of the entire process. And I think too often in the West in general, and in the United States in particular, we define difference. We define ourselves by difference rather than defining ourselves by similarities. And so in all of my work, I'm very interested in creating a space for people directly affected by events, by crises, by incidents, to allow them the privilege of speaking for themselves rather than having so-called, quote-unquote, sort of disembodied experts speaking on their behalf, but really creating a space for people to speak for themselves. And in the context of this particular project, one thing I think that's been particularly fascinating, allowing people to speak for themselves, is beginning to recognize the similarities that happen not just from the military experience, but across our societies. And recognizing that we live in a society that does not deal with mental and emotional health the way it should. And that's not just a veteran problem, that's a social problem. We live in a society where there are people who experience the trauma of poverty, who live in the south side of Chicago, who are as traumatized as, folks who experience a quote-unquote combat experience, who have very points of parallel experiences that we have this profound opportunity to really sort of create pathways to empathy and understanding by recognizing the similarities that manifest themselves in our society. And I think this medium of film is a great way to do that because we can show people speaking about these things that speak to these different experiences.
Garrett, is he telling the truth? Is that what's happening?
I don't know. He's a tough guy. Yeah, to add to that, what he's saying is essentially that veterans are a quantifiable slice of a much larger pie. Like, we are a direct reflection of the society that we come from and the society that sends us to war and cheers us on and rah-rahs us at stadiums. Like, if you take any issue that plagues, I mean, what I say is the issues that are plaguing veterans right now are much less a reflection of the experience of war and much more a reflection of the society that they come from.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that
You can clap for that. That was hot. That was true.
We'll move on. I got an applause. That's all I need.
And he knows when to cut it. I like that. Timing is everything. Major General, I mean, talking about the society that we are returning from, you're in it. Baltimore was featured today in Baltimore. A verdict came out in one of the 6 police officers in the Freddie Gray case, not guilty. I'm sure there's going to be continuing tension, anticipation, pain, anger. How does your work as a kind of military presence, but not overseas, not far away, right here in the streets, how does that play out any differently from your experience prior when you were in the Army? And what are you seeing amongst your people who are among the people day in and day out?
Yeah, well, I would say that, first, there's a lot of similarities. And there's similarities in the sense that you have to understand the community that you're serving. You can't just walk into that community and say, I know what you're feeling, because if you've never, ever walked in their shoes, the same as a veteran, you may not necessarily know what they're feeling. But what we can do is at least reach out to be very empathetic. And we have to be compassionate. And I think the trouble that we have right now, especially within some of our cities and within our society, is that we start from a position of non-trust. I don't trust you because I don't know you. I don't trust you because you're not going to work on my behalf, instead of starting from a position of trust and then let's work from there. And there's a lot of reasons why we've ended up in this place. But for the most part, they want respect. They want to be heard. They want to have a platform to have a discussion. And they want to be able to see things move forward. They do not want us to come in and say, we're going to paint the streets. Because painting the streets does not bring jobs. It does not solve the core issues. It doesn't put food on their table. And it doesn't help them to get better educated when we've shut down the libraries within their community and they have no place to go. And so the only thing that we can do as an organization, as a populace, is that we have to be patient. We have to push for the system to work. Because if we don't push for the system to work and we just complain about it, then it's never, ever going to work. And so it is critical for us to continue to strive to bring the discussions to the table so that we can work through it. Their voices will not be heard if we're talking about protest. They're just because they're doing it in a way that they're being destructive. And so the thing that I kept sending messages today as I was on the way up here on the train. I was watching everything that was going on. I'm thinking, okay, I might have to turn around and go back. Hopefully that was not the case. And what I kept sending out to individuals and some of the leaders is that we need to have patience. We need to be compassionate, and we need to stand strong. Now, those were to some of the ones that have to respond, right? And they were not the ones in uniform. So you can imagine, the individuals I'm talking to. And that is part of my responsibility, is to continue to help remind them as well. And so I think that we have a responsibility. I think the military can bring so much to this. The veterans, I've asked for the veteran community to step out into the community because I think we have so much to offer in terms of core values, in terms of helping them to see that life could be so much worse. And so I would have to say just, patience, and be compassionate, and then let's just trust that the process is going to work. It just may not be the perfect thing that we want to hear, but it will work.
It's so great to hear you say that, especially we're in a presidential election year, and I think there's still time to get you ballot access to put your name up there, because you're sounding real reasonable right now and like unifying. How frustrating is it, or how do you handle the frustration of so much of what you just said sounds well beyond the scope of the Adjutant General for the state of Maryland? You don't build schools. You don't create jobs or bring businesses to the state of Maryland. You don't reopen libraries. That is not your job. But people, you're being asked to deal with the consequences of that not being done. Do you have an outlet for that?
I mean, part of my job is building relationships. It's going out and interacting with other community leaders. It's helping them to understand what I'm hearing and what we're hearing as an overall organization. And so I would say, while it may not be part of my responsibility, it is part of my responsibility as a leader to kind of associate with other leaders that can do something about it. And so every chance I get, I try to interact and help wherever I can. And if another leader calls on me and says they need me to help support them because they may not know how to move forward, then it is part of my role to be able to help do that. I think it's just part of my community role to help do that.
Yeah, ballot access, Major General in the same. That's, right? Thank you for that. Kind of back me up on that. Yep. See. Um, I wanted to know, back to you, Michael, because I saw your work on Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, that is. And you talked about similarities, and I want to pry into that a little bit more. That was a traumatic natural disaster made worse by some man-made flaws before, during, and after. What are you seeing in terms of overlap and similarities in the stories, in the community, in the responses on the storytelling side? What have you unlocked? What has surprised you? What has warmed your heart?
Well, that's interesting. I think what I saw after Sandy is very similar to what Sebastian talked about in terms of after 9/11. It happens in any crisis situation, whether natural disaster or unnatural disaster or unnaturally, worsened natural disaster, where people just come together. They just band together and find common cause. And so what I also experienced with how people sort of share their story, people sort of remember what I like to call kind of reconstruct their own personal legend. And that how they construct their own legends is like directly related to the amount of trauma and the level of crisis they've experienced in their life, and how far or close they are from the kind of epicenter of that crisis really affects how they talk about their story and why they talk about their story. And I've seen, and that relates, I think, to how people shared their story in the days, moments, now months after Hurricane Sandy is very similar in some ways to how people talking about any kind of trauma, particularly military trauma, talk about that experience. And I'm not just talking about the trauma of serving in combat, but just sort of like the trauma of being 18, going into a system where you're told you're the most important, special, like focused, like killing machine on earth, perhaps, or you were raised in a society, as Garrett and I talk about how you're raised in a society where you're told that the one thing you cannot do is kill, and then you go into a system where you're told that the one thing you have to do is kill, like regardless if you ever see combat or not, regardless if you're just, in the motor pool, that affects your psyche. And I see very similar things to people who were in the Rockaways after the storm, no power, no aid from the federal government, just like tasked with only their own resiliency, only their own leadership, and only the people around them to be able to sort of navigate that challenge.
Thank you. I was just in awe and absorbing the answer. We're going to open this up to the rest of you, to our new nation. We should come up with a name for our society, by the way. We have about 10 minutes, and if you raise your hand, we have microphone runners, and we will find you. So please raise your hand if you have thoughts or questions to share with our esteemed panel. Of course, the very last row. She's going to make us work for it. Yeah, that's true. She is Edge. Thank you.
Sebastian, you talk a lot in your book about basically the role of income inequality and how that has really kind of broken down our sense of tribal community, and when you have people earning so much more at the expense of others who end up earning so little. The timing of this is really great, given that we are about to have an election. And income inequality is one of those things that's talked a lot about on one side of the aisle and not so much on the other side of the aisle. And I was hoping for those of us who are really attuned to this issue and see it day to day. I'm a social worker. I work with veterans, and I work with veterans who are struggling in every element of the socioeconomic structure. Can you talk a little bit about what you hope to see, and what all of you, I guess, hope to see in the next, 9 months to battle this? Because I don't see this getting better right now. I see this getting worse. And what I see on TV, it does not give me a lot of hope. So what gives you guys hope?
Thank you for that. For me, I feel as a journalist, it's very important that I'm not an advocate. I don't tell the country what to do, even if I had that platform. What I do in my book Tribe, and what I try to do, is describe the world as it is. And in Tribe, what I'm describing is during most of our evolution, we lived in small groups where differentials in access to food and to property was minimal. Right? So it's not like you had people feasting and people starving within the same small group of 50 people, right? That's our human history. And when you look at modern society is a different deal, and I get it. And it's given rise to incredible income and resource inequality of every kind. The point in my book isn't that, oh, well, here's a fix for that. The point of my book is we've departed from what we're wired for, and that has emotional consequences for us. One of the ways I looked at this is through the lens of veterans returning home, and I found a study that said that the greater the income differential within a country, the more, I'm going by memory here, but the more psychologically stressful that society is. And veterans coming home are, at least for a while, a psychologically vulnerable group. And the more egalitarian the society is, and in monetary terms as well, the more easily they will adjust, because keep in mind, they are coming from a very egalitarian and social environment, which is the platoon, right? And you're judged on your merits in a platoon. You're not judged, as we are in society, by how wealthy our parents are, our race, or whatever. I mean, pick something out of a hat. You're really not judged, at least in combat, by those sort of surface things. And then you come back to a society where everyone is judged that way. It's extremely hard. So we've departed from that tribal way of being. I don't know if there's an easy fix, but at least it's good to understand the mechanisms of it.
Is this ringing true to you two in particular, some of what he's saying about returning home to something so different from what it's like to be deployed or be in a military unit?
I mean, I see a lot of, the veteran community online, especially the one that's active on social media, that, when there was the $15 an hour for fast food workers thing, there was a lot of people who spoke out about that, and for fear of opening a huge can of worms right now, my thing is should those people make less, or should, an E2 in the Army make more? Because those guys are making $1,100, $1,200 a month. And that doesn't make that doesn't make sense to me. We interviewed a guy who talked about private contractors making $130,000 a year. Well, you have career soldiers making $1,200 a month. That doesn't make sense. So, I mean, I don't know how to answer her question, and I'm going to drop the subject there, but, it's an issue.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Well, I think for my situation, it's a little different because I worked in private industry and I'm now full-time uniform. So I actually switched the other way, which most people go the opposite way. But what I will tell you is I work with a lot of veterans groups. And if we just talk about just where we are as a society, you're always going to have individuals who are going to make more or less than others. It's always been that way. My grandmother cleaned houses for a living, but she raised 14 kids of her own, plus me was number 15. And I never, ever heard her complain. And we lived in a 4-room house. And so when I think of, we have to take it and say, well, my position is going to be very different than maybe somebody else's in this room, because I came from a very different background. I know what it is to not have a lot, but yet be loved and have everything. And so I think if we get back to what are the core things that we need love. We need to be compassionate. We need to be considerate. We need to find where we are more alike than not alike. Because I will tell you, I will hire a veteran any single day. But if you're competent, I'm going to hire anyone, right? So I'm looking at skills. I'm looking at what you bring to the table. But I think the challenging thing is how do we get more veterans to really bring out what are the core things that they're really good at? And the majority of them are good at leadership. They're good at a lot of different things, right? So they have to help with that. But if I just think about the disparities and the inequalities, you're always going to have that in a society. Because for me to say that someone came out of high school, I came out of high school and I quit school. No high school diploma. But that's not where I am today. But had I been, I wouldn't be sitting here as a general. I probably wouldn't even have been much less more than a private.
I wasn't a private.
I'm sorry.
Da, 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 da. President sings. Yep.
Hi, we it seems like you've talked about storytelling as a method for a number of different things. National dialogue being important to healing, important to awareness. However, I wonder, as a veteran, how we as a society, in the small communities of veterans and their families, and also like, outside, how do we take control of that national discourse? Because it doesn't seem that way. I mean, with very few exceptions, what are the movies telling people about the war? What are the movies telling people about the people whom we make war on?
This is like,
Go ahead, Gary.
this is one of my favorite questions, because when we see content created around veterans issues, it's always one-sided from the perspective of the veteran, and we see the rest of the people in those countries as a backdrop to those conflicts. And when the American people see war on television, they assume, on the news, they assume that everybody at the end of those rifle rounds and everybody at the end of those bombs are bad guys. And that's not the case. And I think that it's important that the American people hand the narrative over to veterans to start telling their own story. But veterans have to step up to the plate and take control of the narrative, or work in cooperation with people to help tell those stories, because, a lot of people don't have the resource to do it on their own. But I encourage veterans to get involved in writing, get involved in television, get involved in documentary filmmaking, get involved in journalism, and tell their experiences to this world in a way that properly represents that experience.
Yeah. Good cheer for that. Another question? One more question. Oh, the last one is going to be the greatest.
All right, as veterans, we're pretty much seeing our country torn up by politics. It used to get ugly, but now this is hideous. What can we as veterans do to bridge that political divide of getting to understand that that conservatives or liberals, they're not the enemy. It's not good guys versus bad guys. It's pretty much a disagreement of two courses of how to pretty much plan the policies of our nation or our communities to find solutions to problems that we've been going around for decades. How do you feel, can we tone down the language and, as veterans, be leaders rather than be a part of this turmoil?
Don't all jump at once.
Well, so I'm in a totally different situation, right? Because I am still a leader wearing the uniform, and I am there to support my country. I am there to perform a service that I signed up to do 35 years ago. It doesn't matter to me who's leading this country. It doesn't matter to me what the Congress looks like. What matters to me is I'm going to stay focused on my job and focused on my objective and leading my service members as I've signed up to do. So that is my focus. I'm not listening to all the noise. I'm staying very focused on my service members, my people, and my country.
I have a question, though.
Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Mike. No.
I just want to speak that real quickly. I think I want to flip that and say that I think I'm actually hopeful despite the vitriol that we see. I think, building off the comment Garrett made, there's an opportunity for veterans and non-veterans to reclaim that narrative, to be able to tell the stories. I mean, in addition to, we're a profound moment in America, I think. And in addition to the economic inequality, I would complicate that and say there are three pillars that are our greatest obstacles to unity in this country, and they're economic inequality, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And they all sort of don't allow us to be emotionally vulnerable. They don't allow us to acknowledge our faults. But I would say that there is an actual conversation that is happening in this country that is at a low roar, maybe we'll say, that isn't getting the attention in the punditry and the evening news as much, but the vitriol, the caustic bigotry and the vitriol that we see is, in my opinion, humble anecdotal opinion, in response to a shifting society. And it's the last gasp of an old order trying to hold on. And so I think we have an opportunity to be able to grasp that narrative by telling these stories that need to be told, whether you're a veteran or whether you're not.
Garrett Combs.
So in reference to your book, you know, I've listened to you talk on some different podcasts, and you mentioned that you went into war correspondence because you felt like you needed to test your salt. I'm like paraphrasing, but that was a motivation. And you spent years in war-torn countries, and then you eventually found yourself on a mountaintop in Korengal with 25 guys for a year. After spending all of that time on that mountaintop with those guys, did you feel like you found a tribe?
Yeah, very much so. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was in war for 15, 20 years. Most of the wars I covered did not involve the U.S. military, and I was alone, and usually not speaking the language of that country, and when I was with U.S. soldiers, it was the first time I was in a combat zone with sort of my own people. I mean, by that I mean from the same country with a common language, and that really allows for bonding. And I'd never quite experienced. I'd never experienced an ordeal with a group before, and that's of course how humans have experienced ordeals for 2 million years. And I had never gone through something really hard with a group, dependent on them, and them to some degree, at least dependent on me to not screw up, and which is an important duty, by the way. And I came out of that completely transformed as a person. I think it was extraordinary, profound experience, and sort of cracked me wide open, I think.
Well, I want to thank you all for cracking us wide open. What? Yes, he did. Michael Primo, Garrett Combs, Major General Linda Singh, Sebastian Junger. Sebastian will be signing books. We all get a book. You get a book, and you get a book. Oprah's not signing books, but we're still happy. I want to thank PBS, CPB, ITVS, ABC, and 123 for making this possible. But most of the first 3 sets of letters, and of course TED, for pulling it all together. And thank you, Noy House. And are there any other housekeeping notes that anyone needs me to share? All right, hashtag is TED Talks PBS. This episode airs next Monday on PBS, and you should tell everybody. And this stream is on the Veterans Come Home Facebook page, which I assume will be stored there, so you can share it with all your networks, like as soon as I stop talking. Go do it now. Share it now. You're not sharing. Seriously, share it right now. All right, your phone's still on your